So, this is the Russian dude. New haircut, sunburn, the weekend was good. Russia may have just revealed one of the biggest weaknesses in its entire war strategy. And the strange part is that it did not happen because Ukraine captured a single massive city, or because one dramatic frontline breakthrough suddenly changed the map overnight. But because simply Russia started moving the one thing its soldiers were supposed to rely on when everything else was falling apart, which is air defense systems. And according to the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, those systems are now being pulled away from the front and redirected towards places that Moscow considers more important, which is places like Moscow. Just like your brain telling you that brain is the most important organ in your body. But anyways, all this tells us something very simple, cynical, and extremely revealing about how the Kremlin thinks when it is forced to choose between protecting its soldiers and people, and protecting the image of power around Vladimir Putin. Because officially Russia would never admit that this is a retreat from responsibility, and it would never say out loud that some positions on the front line are becoming less protected so that Moscow, the Kerch Strait Bridge or the Crimean Bridge and Valdai can feel safer. But that is exactly what this decision suggests. And the moment you understand why Valdai, specifically on these three matters, this story becomes even more telling. Because Valdai is not Russia's second largest city, it's not St. Petersburg, it's not even a major city. It's not some ordinary even military hub that every normal person would immediately recognize as a top national priority. No, nothing like this. It is the area connected with elite residences, vacation homes, and Putin's very own dacha. So this is some kind of a protected, pretty much political comfort zone that tells you, better than any speech ever would, who this system is really designed to serve. So today we're not just talking about air defense systems moving from one location to another, because, that would be way too simple. The video will not need to be 20 minutes long. Even though pulling lines of defenses from literal front lines is a huge thing by itself. No, we are talking about a strategic trap that Ukraine has been building for years. A trap where Russia is now forced to choose between defending the image of safety at home and defending the actual military structure that keeps its front lines functioning. And the more Putin tries to protect the symbol of control, the more it may expose the machinery of the war itself. By the way, guys, you showed an enormous interest about the video of a failed Russian meat assault that I uploaded to my Patreon on Monday. Everyone was as shocked as I was when I saw it for the very first time, which pretty much just once again confirms and shows how unprepared and amateur modern Russian military in Ukraine is. And so in case you missed that video because my previous episode unfortunately did not get that many views, you can still find that meat assault video on Patreon. The post is only from 2 days ago, July 6th. The link is down below. Thanks so much. Your memberships are the best way to support our work we do here on YouTube. Now, let's begin. Here is where it gets interesting, because when people hear that Russia is moving air defense systems away from the frontline areas, the first reaction is usually to ask whether this means Russian troops are immediately abandoning their physical positions. And the answer is, well, not quite yet, at least not in the most direct sense. We're not necessarily talking about infantry units packing up their things, and we're not talking about drone operators leaving every forward position at once. But in a war like this, removing air defense from an area is often the very first step in a much larger process. Because once the sky becomes less protected, everything underneath it becomes harder to sustain. That is why the destination matters so much too. Zelensky said Russian air defense systems are being redirected towards three major places: Moscow, Kerch Strait Bridge, and Valdai. Well, Moscow is obvious, because if Ukraine can keep reaching the Russian capital, then Putin has a domestic political problem, not just a military one. The Kerch Strait, or Crimean Bridge, is, well, also obvious, because that bridge is one of Russia's most important symbols and logistics connections to occupied Crimea. And every time it looks vulnerable, the entire Russian narrative about Crimea starts to look more fragile. But Valdai is the part that makes the story feel almost too honest. Because this is not where ordinary Russian soldiers sit in trenches, and this is not where the average Russian family is waiting for protection. It's not like they get any protection anyways, but, well, anyways. This is where elites can go when Moscow feels too exposed, when internal pressure rises, or when the people at the top simply want the comfort of knowing that their own retreat zone remains shielded. And that tells us something brutal about priorities. Russia has spent years telling its own people that this war is existential, that sacrifice is necessary, and that the frontline soldier is some kind of a sacred symbol of the state. But when the pressure increases and the hard choices arrive, the system behaves exactly the way authoritarian systems usually behave. It protects the capital, it protects the bridge, it protects the elite safe zone, and only after that does it think about the people sitting in exposed positions across occupied Ukraine. The reason this matters is because air defense is not just a technical asset, it is a political mirror. When Russia moves these systems, it is showing Ukraine and, well, pretty much the rest of the world what it fears the most, and is showing most importantly the Russian people, whether they notice it or not, at least not yet maybe, who gets protected first when there are not enough systems to protect everyone. And once Ukraine sees that pattern clearly, the next question becomes much more important, because this may not be a desperate Russian adjustment as much as it is the exact Russian reaction Ukraine wanted to provoke. Now keep this upcoming fact in mind because it is about to become very important. Russia is not really choosing freely here. Even though Moscow would obviously present every movement of its systems as careful planning and every defensive adjustment as strategic wisdom, but in reality, Ukraine has been creating the incentives, and Russia is simply reacting to them. That is the part of the story that matters the most today, because the most powerful position in any conflict is not always the side that has the most equipment, but the side that forces the other side to spend its limited equipment in exactly the wrong places. Over the last period of the war, Ukraine has been increasing pressure on Russian logistics, on Crimea and then even on Moscow itself. The pressure around the Kerch Strait Bridge has become especially important because Crimea depends on reliable movement of supplies, fuel and vehicles, and the more that flow is disrupted, the more expensive and unstable the entire occupation becomes. There are also well-known facts and reports that Crimea has already faced and still is facing fuel shortages because trucks simply cannot easily move through this as easy. While the Moscow refinery also has been reportedly taken offline. You remember this story, right? With some experts saying it may even remain offline until at least next year, 2027, which is a very serious timeline because Russia's peak fuel demand is happening during the very season when these disruptions matter the most. That is the dilemma Ukraine has created. Putin can either leave Moscow and Crimea more vulnerable, which damages the image of control and makes ordinary Russians wonder why the war keeps coming home, or he can pull protection towards those politically sensitive locations and obviously weaken areas closer to the front line. And for a leader like Putin, well, unfortunately for Russians, this is not a very complicated choice, because the perception of strength inside Russia is not a side issue. It is part of the foundation of his power. If Moscow looks exposed, if Crimea looks unstable, if the Kerch Strait Bridge looks threatened, then the war stops being something happening somewhere else and starts becoming something that touches the mythology of the regime. This is where Ukraine's strategy becomes more sophisticated than just simply hitting random whatever targets are available. Ukraine has watched Russia for years. It has seen how Moscow replaces systems after Ukrainian operations in Crimea. It has seen which areas Russia rushes to protect and which areas Russia allows to absorb more risk. Every time Russia moves an air defense system, it gives away a little more information about what the Kremlin actually values, what it fears, and what it will sacrifice if pressure becomes a little bit too high. And this is why the current moment feels different from the slow, grinding rhythm that has defined so much of the war. For a long time, the map moved, unfortunately slowly, sometimes painfully slowly, and many people started to assume that nothing dramatic could ever happen unless one side launched a massive, unexpected traditional offensive, similar to Kharkiv or Kherson. But Ukraine may be trying to change the conditions before the offensive even begins, because if Russia can be forced to uncover parts of the front in order to protect Moscow, Crimea and Valdai, then the front line does not even need to be broken only by just direct force. It can first be weakened by forcing Russia to move the shield itself away. This detail I'm about to speak about right now changes absolutely everything, because air defense is not just about stopping drones or missiles from reaching a target. It is one of the reasons the war has looked the way it has looked for years. Neither Russia nor Ukraine has truly controlled the skies over the entire battlefield, and that fact has shaped almost every major decision on both sides. Aircrafts have remained valuable but limited, because neither side wants to risk scarce pilots and planes in areas where dense air defense can punish even one single tiny mistake. And so, as a result, Russia built one of its most important offensive methods around that particular reality. Its aircraft could operate behind Russian air defense shield and release glide bombs from a distance, allowing them to pressure Ukrainian positions while keeping the aircraft themselves further from the immediate danger. These glide bombs became one of Russia's most consistent tools of grinding forward, because even when Russian infantry attacks were costly and slow, glide bombs could make entire Ukrainian positions much more harder to hold over time. But if Russia starts to remove air defenses from the entire sections of Frontline, then it does not only weaken Russian defenses, it also weakens the conditions that allowed Russia's offense to function. Russian aircraft become more cautious. Ukrainian aircraft and drones get more room to operate. Certain parts of the front become less protected from Ukrainian pressure, and suddenly the very system that allowed Russia to keep pushing in small increments starts to lose some of its foundation. This becomes even more important because Ukraine is not standing still. Ukraine has started developing and using glide bombs of its own, and those weapons become more valuable if Russia's defensive coverage begins to develop gaps. Ukraine has also announced plans to bring Swedish Gripen fighter jets into its arsenal, and if those Gripens arrive near the front at the same time as Russian air defense systems are stretched thinner than ever, then Ukraine may find opportunities that simply did not even exist earlier in the war. This does not mean the front suddenly becomes easy, and does not mean every Russian position becomes vulnerable overnight, because war is never that clean and never that simple, but it does mean the underlying equation begins to shift. Russia has spent years relying on the idea that Ukraine cannot easily challenge the skies near the front, while Ukraine has spent years trying to neutralize the systems that make that true. If the shortage becomes severe enough, then the front line becomes less like a wall and more like a structure with weak points. And Ukraine does not need every single section to collapse all at once. It only needs enough openings to make Russia start guessing wrong. And once Russia starts guessing, or better say Putin starts guessing, he faces another problem, because the front line is not only held by what happens on the front line, it is also held, but most importantly, by everything behind it. And that rear area may be even more vulnerable than the trench line itself. Let's now look at this from a different angle, because when people talk about the front, they usually imagine soldiers facing each other across fields, trenches, defensive belts, but the real life of a front line depends on everything happening behind it. A position is only as strong as the fuel, ammunition, water, food, rotations, and logistics, all that keeps it alive. If those things stop arriving, even a heavily fortified position becomes a burden. That is exactly why the reports from Ukrainian drone pilots are so important. They say they are increasingly able to operate with less Russian air defense interference, and that matters, because drones are not just weapons in the traditional sense. They are a way to turn every road, every supply truck, and every movement behind the front line into a potential problem. Just think about it. If Russian systems are moved away from occupied areas to protect, once again, Moscow, Crimea, Kerch Strait Bridge, and Valdai, then the rear becomes way more open. And once the rear becomes more open, the front line becomes harder to maintain. This is the logistics lockdown problem. Russia can have soldiers in positions, but if supplies cannot reliably reach them, then the position becomes weaker every day. If ammunition becomes less predictable, attacks become harder. If fuel becomes scarce, movement slows. If food and water deliveries become dangerous, morale deteriorates. If commander cannot rotate units without exposing them, exhaustion grows. And if every single soldier fighting knows that the air defense systems they were counting on have been moved somewhere else to protect Putin's dacha, literally, then the psychological effect may be just as important as the material one. Because imagine being a Russian soldier, in that situation. Not like that, probably you want to do it, but just imagine. On a normal day, you are already under pressure, already poorly supplied compared to what the propaganda promised, already being asked to hold ground in miserable conditions, and already even aware that assaults can be extremely costly, like 90% chance of not being able to survive. But now, the protective umbrella above you becomes thinner, because the Kremlin decided Moscow, Crimea, and elite areas need the systems more than your sector does. I mean, at that point, the calculation changes completely. It is no longer just dangerous to move forward. It starts just feeling unsafe to just stay where you are. That is where abandonment can become contagious. Not because every unit receives an order to leave, and not because the entire army collapses in one dramatic movie scene, but because local decisions begin to shift. One position becomes less sustainable, one road becomes too risky, one unit loses confidence, and then another unit sees it, then commanders start moving reserves to patch these holes, then air defense systems shortage becomes a manpower problem, a logistics problem, and a command problem all at the same time. So many problems. And this is where Ukraine's use of ground robotics could become especially important, because if Ukraine can combine drones, robotics, and better air support in places where Russian air defense is thinner, then it may not even need to throw everything into one huge cinematic assault to create pressure. It can simply make selected areas unbearable for Russian forces to hold, and then that kind of pressure can sometimes achieve what a traditional offensive struggles to do, which is basically force the opponent to move, because staying itself becomes worse than leaving. And here's the real reason all we spoke about today matters so much. Putin might now be trapped in a cycle where every answer creates the next problem. If Ukraine pressures Moscow and Crimea, Russia moves air defense systems there. If Russia moves air defense systems there, the front and the rear becomes more vulnerable. If Ukraine then increases pressure on exposed frontline or rear areas, Russia has to consider moving those systems back again. But if Russia moves systems back, Moscow, Crimea, the Kerch Strait Bridge or Valdai becomes more exposed once again. Never-ending cycle. And Ukraine can simply return to those targets with even more information about how Russia responds. That is this cycle, that is this trap. It's not a trap where Putin has zero choices, however. It's a trap where every choice is bad. Protect Moscow, weaken the front line. Protect the front line and risk more pressure on Moscow. Protect Crimea and so as a result expose other occupied areas. Protect Valdai and make the symbolism even worse. Because nothing says elite first more clearly than defending elite comfort zones where frontline positions lose coverage. And the irony is that even moving more air defense systems into Moscow may not even fully solve the problem. I mean, Moscow already has layers of air defenses, and yet Ukraine has still managed somehow to get through and reach strategic targets, such as the Moscow refinery several weeks ago, even Kremlin. That is the kind of detail that becomes almost symbolic, because Russia is trying to protect the capital from Ukraine, but in the process, it may be creating new danger through its own defensive panic. This is why the air defense story matters far beyond just one single system, one city, or one bridge. It shows that Ukraine is not just trying to push against Russia's strength. Ukraine is trying to make Russia spend its strength in the wrong places. It is trying to turn Putin's political instincts against his military needs. It is trying to make the Kremlin defend symbols so aggressively that the actual battlefield becomes much weaker. And for years, Russia's strategy has depended on the assumption that time helps Moscow, that Ukraine will eventually run out of resources, that Western attention will fade, and that Putin can absorb costs longer than anyone else. But this moment challenges that assumption, because if Russia is running short enough on air defenses that it has to choose between protecting the front line and protecting the image of power, then time may not be working the way Putin hoped. Time may be exposing the weaknesses that was always hidden underneath the size of the Russian state. That does not mean that the war is over. Fortunately, not today, not tomorrow, not this week, unfortunately, I mean. And it does not mean everything changes tomorrow morning, but it does mean that the strategic environment is shifting in a way that could become extremely important. Air defense was one of the pillars of how Russia fought this war. If that pillar is now being moved around in panic, then the structure above it becomes way less stable. And once a structure starts losing stability, the next shock matters much more than the last one. So the real question now is not only where Russia moves its air defenses next, but what Ukraine does with the openings that movement creates. Because if Ukraine can combine pressure on Moscow, pressure on Crimea, disruption around the Kerch Strait Bridge and attack on logistics, then Russia may find itself in the worst possible position, which is defending everything symbolically important while becoming weaker in the places that actually decide the war. And that is why this story is worth watching closely, because it may be the beginning of a new phase, where Ukraine is no longer just only reacting to Russian pressure, but instead actively forcing Russia into choices it does not want to make. So guys, if you feel like some big change in this war is coming, please make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, don't forget about the Patreon, link is down below. Thanks so much for watching, see you on Friday.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell, their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.